The New York Mets have finally hired a GM. They did it. They got someone. Billy Eppler is the new GM. And also, we had the first major signing of the offseason take place on Monday. Going to cover all of that on today's episode of Locked On Mets.
You are Locked On Mets, your daily New York Mets podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello to all you amazing Mets fans. You're listening to Locked On Mets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Thank you for making Locked On Mets your first listen every day. Locked On Mets is free and available on all platforms, including YouTube. Now, full disclosure, I already had a podcast in the can ready to go when we saw the announcement that Billy Eppler is officially the Mets GM. In the first segment, previously, I had talked about it as a hypothetical. Now it's a reality. We're going to change that segment out here as I will discuss the fact the Mets have finally done it. They finally have a GM. But then throughout the rest of the show, you're going to hear my original recording where I was still talking about the Eppler potential hiring as hypothetical, but I discussed the Eduardo Rodriguez signing as he is the first major domino to fall in free agency. Last offseason, James McCann was the first domino to fall, and that took place about a month later than Eduardo Rodriguez signing this deal. So I'm going to talk about the implications of the CBA on free agency, the fact that that is certainly making free agents rush right now to try to get their money now before a potential lockdown. Before we get to any of that, though, I'm your host, Ryan Finkelstein. If you want to find any of my work, follow me on Twitter at FinkelsteinRyan. You can also find some of my writing about the Mets at justbaseball.com, where I actually did write a piece talking about Eduardo Rodriguez and that altered timeline of MLB free agency that you can find now. And again, we will discuss that a little bit later. But let's get to the breaking news, and that's that Billy Eppler is now the New York Mets GM. Now, we'll do some more shows throughout the week, maybe diving into this, maybe getting some opinions from others who have a little bit more information on why the Mets made this hire, and we can dive into this deeper. But to me, the biggest takeaway is twofold. One, this still is another tea leaf that's leading us towards the door of David Stearns being the Mets' next president of baseball operations, because reportedly those two are very close. So this could just be that first step. You hire Billy Eppler now. Maybe Stearns comes in next year after his contract with the Brewers is up. And that is the absolute pipe dream that could result in this front office finally being stable for the foreseeable future. But right now, to me, the biggest takeaway is it's done. It's finally over. This long, drawn out process has come to a close. And I'm not going to say that I love Billy Eppler as a GM. We last saw him as the general manager of the Angels from 2015 through 2020. That didn't work well. I always say the biggest crime in baseball is that Jacob deGrom hasn't pitched in a playoff game since 2015. You can say that Mike Trout not playing in a playoff game is right up there with deGrom. I mean, this is one of the biggest travesties in the sport. You had the best player in baseball and you couldn't make the playoffs. It's not necessarily a great ringing endorsement for what he brings to the table. You also have the fact that he hired Mickey Callaway in Los Angeles when apparently there was a pretty well-known reputation of those reports that we eventually found out last offseason that Mickey Callaway was very degrading to women and just not a good guy to be around. So that is definitely not a great sign. It's something we should mention, we should talk about when it comes to this signing or this hiring of Billy Eppler. But at the end of the day, what have I been talking about on this show? I did a whole podcast about Adam Cromie, who was the leading frontrunner last week. And I said, just make a hire. And at the end of the day, we can nitpick whether this is the best guy available. We can talk about his resume on the field or all the other stuff that you can dissect when it comes to Eppler and his reputation. But at the end of the day, the process is over. And for me, that is a massive win, because every single day that this thing got dragged out, the Mets were getting dragged through the mud. They were looking worse and worse around the league. You had to get this resolution because at the end of the day, as we're going to discuss in a bit here, free agency is happening right now. There's a 2-week window before that CBA comes up where free agents are going to be rushing to get their money early. You have to decide what you're going to do with Javi Baez. Does he want a deal now? Because if he does, now you need to be moving towards making those decisions. You have to hire a manager. There's so many things that need to be done. And at the end of the day, this whole process of hiring a GM or a president, it has been an abject failure again. There's no way to look at this as anything but that. They had a ton of candidates that were on their list ahead of Billy Eppler. That's just been the reported facts. And here's where they're settling. But Billy Eppler does have experience as a GM. He did work with the Yankees for, I believe, a decade, was eventually their assistant GM. So he has a pedigree. While his first crack as a GM didn't work out, maybe this one does. I mean, I wouldn't say it's even necessarily more resources because the Angels certainly spent money during his time there, but maybe this is the right mix for him and things work out. At the end of the day, the only way all of this is worth it is if you get David Stearns next offseason. But at the end of the day, as I've been saying, at least you can move on and you can get to all of the tasks you have to address this offseason. And the one thing that I think is clear at this point, when the Mets were only going to make one hire, is there was not a single executive that was going to come in here that was going to unilaterally change the makeup of the Mets front office. A lot of these guys who are already there are going to be integral to moving forward. Tommy Tanos, Levin, Brent Alderson, all these different guys that have been part of this team for so many years, they're still going to be part of the decision-making process. Now there is a new guy atop it running the day-to-day, but I don't think that this changes too much with how the Mets are going to approach this offseason. But you can finally get to that point. And maybe the Mets 2 weeks ago should have just named Tommy Tanos the GM, stuck internal with the guys that they had, and just move forward. But they have made a hire, and I think the fact that they've made a hire makes it a good hire just to end this process because, again, it was so detrimental to the Mets moving forward to continue to basically have their rejection be made public and be laughed at across baseball every single day. Another rejection. And a future episode of Locked On Mets, I'm going to talk about Steve Cohen getting rejected and can he start to sell people on being a Met, because at the end of the day, the Mets traded for Francisco Lindor. Last offseason, they didn't get George Springer. They didn't get Trevor Bauer, which was a huge bullet dodged, but at the time, he was a top free agent that they targeted who chose another team. They also went out and they got James McCann, the second option when it came to the free agent starting catchers, because JT Realmuto expressed no interest in coming to the Mets, and they decided they couldn't miss out on the second best option. So the Mets have not done a great job attracting people to New York when it comes to players last offseason and when it comes to executives both off seasons. So that is something that Steve Cohen's going to have to prove going forward, that he can build an organization that's attractive for people to come in without just overpaying everybody. We'll see the moves the Mets make throughout the offseason. It's still very early to judge the Steve Cohen tenure. I don't want to jump to rash conclusions. It's still a million times better than the Wilpons. That I am sure of. This hire is not something that I'm going to hold up and say, this is the best move the Mets have made. They're going in the right direction. But what I will say is at least you made a hire and you can move past what has been a failure and hopefully start to build some successes moving forward. And maybe Billy Eppler surprises us. And again, if it ends up leading us to a road where it's David Stearns and Billy Eppler running your front office, this is a massive home run. Now we will get to the previously recorded segment where I discussed the Eduardo Rodriguez signing and what it means for this offseason as the timeline has been moved up due to the expiring CBA. BetOnline is back and better than ever, now featuring a new web interface for the start of the basketball season with more props, odds, and lines available than ever before. BetOnline remains your number one spot for all the basketball and football action this season. Head to their new updated desktop or mobile website to sign up today and receive your 50% welcome bonus on your first deposit just by using our promo code Locked On. From basketball, football, NHL, boxing, UFC, right to your favorite Vegas casino games, don't wait to take advantage of all the amazing offers available for the 2021 season. BetOnline is the fastest and easiest way to bet on all your favorite sports. Bet online, where the game starts. So the first major domino of the starting pitching market has fallen as Eduardo Rodriguez signed a 5-year, $77 million deal with the Detroit Tigers. For the Tigers, they're in the middle of a rebuild, starting to turn a corner. They have some interesting young prospects that have graduated to the big leagues and shown a bit when it comes to their rotation. So now they get a veteran to plug in there to lead that rotation. Makes a lot of sense for them to just secure a guy when they might not have been able to convince a Marcus Stroman or a Kevin Gausman or Robbie Ray to sign in Detroit. I don't know if the Max Scherzer reunion was going to happen with the Tigers. So they get a guy who is in that second tier. They don't waste any time. They sign him right now. And that is significant because if you are a free agent right now, you might be calling up your agent and saying, that CBA, it's going to be a lockout. Who knows how long the shutdown's going to be? We could be talking weeks. We could be talking months. And I just want my contract now. If you're Marcus Stroman and you've worked this long to get to this point, you might just want the ink to dry on a deal because who knows what could happen. David Peterson was dealing with, what was it? I don't even remember the initial injury. I think it was a lat. Should have done more research if I was going to bring up this example. But the bottom line was he was dealing with some other injury. Maybe it was an oblique. And as he was rehabbing, he was just walking around the clubhouse this year and he broke his foot. You never know what's going to happen. And some of these guys have been working 6, 7, 8 years to get to free agency and to cash in. And they're calling their agents right now like, all right, can we get something on paper? Can we get a deal now so that we have that peace of mind? Eduardo Rodriguez, could he have maybe gotten $85 million? Personally, I don't know, but he got $77 million after pitching to a 4.74 ERA. Now you look at what he's done in the past couple of years, and he certainly is better than that ERA would suggest. The xFIP, much lower than his ERA, still had a solid WAR this year. I'm not trying to sell you on the merits of Eduardo Rodriguez. I'm just saying when you're a pitcher that could have maybe squeezed the stone and got a little bit more, he said, you know what? No. Okay. I'm going to get an average of close to $16 million a year. I think there is incentives to push that deal up to 80, where he would get an AAV of 16 million. And he's got that contract guaranteed. His family is financially secure. I mean, that is generational wealth right there. So, hats off to Eduardo Rodriguez. And I think there are a lot of free agents that are going to be pushing for a deal to get done sooner rather than later, which is a lot different than we saw last year and the previous free agencies before that, where this process was getting more and more drawn out, where guys weren't signing until, the middle of December at the earliest. It was getting stretched out until February. Last year, Marcell Ozuna and Trevor Bauer, two of the most, highly coveted free agents at the time, which turned into two of the biggest, complete disaster signings in retrospect. They didn't sign until February. So the process really got drawn out last year. And this offseason, it's going to be interesting because either you get in early, get your guaranteed money now, or who knows how long you're waiting, because then it could get drawn out even longer than previously expected. Because if there's some lockdown or a strike for 2 or 3 months, you're just a free agent. You're a man without an island, just waiting to figure out where you're going to play the next year, what's going to be resolved with this CBA, and how much money you're going to be making. That's not a seat that a lot of these free agents want to be sitting in. So it's going to be really interesting. I can see the Mets jumping the market right now and signing back some of their guys, Javier Baez being the first that comes to mind. We'll see if Syndergaard ultimately accepts the qualifying offer, but things can move really quickly. Now, with that said, when I was going through the timeline of free agency last offseason, I found some really interesting stuff. As you dive in to free agency last year and you go through the timeline, here's a couple things that jumped out to me. For one, there was only 10 contracts that were given out all of last offseason that were for more than 2 years. Only 10. Just think about the top of your head this offseason, all the people that should get contracts for at least 3 years. Max Scherzer, probably going to get at least 3 years, a really high AAV. Robbie Ray, Kevin Gossman, Marcus Stroman. That's 4 at least. Eduardo Rodriguez just got one, 5-year deal. That's 5. You got all the shortstops, right? You got Trevor Story, Carlos Correa, you got Corey Seager, you got Marcus Semien, likely to get at least 3 years. Chris Bryant, that's 5 right there. That gets you to 10. We haven't even talked about Nick Castellanos, Starling Marte. I mean, there's going to be way more than 10 contracts given out this offseason that are for more than 2 years. So that was the first thing that jumped out to me. Then you dive into the dates of these signings. First one last offseason that was for more than 2 years was James McCann, as I already alluded to. December 12th, signed the 4-year, $40.6 million deal. Then you had Hae-Sung Kim, who signed a 4-year, $28 million deal. That backfired, had a really bad first year playing in the MLB. You had Liam Hendricks, 3-year, $24 million deal that happened January 12th. That was a good signing. He pitched well for the White Sox. DJ LeMahieu, 3 days later with the Yankees, 6 years, $90 million. That was a signing that blew up in their face. He did not have a good season at all. Now you got to question whether you can, pay Carlos Correa when you still got a DJ LeMahieu on the books for 5 more years. That is a dilemma the Yankees are weighing right now. You got George Springer, 6 years, $150 million, a signing I wish the Mets had made last offseason. That came January 20th. He was hurt a lot this year, but when he was on the field, he performed. Jurickson Profar, 3 years, $21 million. That was on the 22nd. JT Realmuto on the 26th of January, 5 years, $115.5 million. He also dealt with some injuries, but a pretty solid season. Tommy La Stella, 3 years, $18.75 million, January 27th. And then you had Trevor Bauer and Marcell Ozuna both signing on February 5th, a day that GM should be avoiding this offseason based on the track record of those two guys. So you get into this offseason. What do we learn from that crop? For one, this is a much better free agent class, but of that list of 10 contracts that were for more than 2 years, a lot of those guys didn't pan out. Outside of Springer and Realmuto and Hendricks, all of them basically had bad years or were, penalized by the league and suspended indefinitely for horrible transgressions off the field in the case of Bauer and Ozuna. That's not to say that this year's class is going to have the similar poor results if you give them more than 2 years, but it is interesting that some of the best signings last offseason were those signings of 1 or 2 years. You're talking about Enrique Hernandez, got a 2-year deal with the Red Sox. You have Robbie Grossman, 2-year deal with the Tigers. He proved to be a really nice signing. Taijuan Walker, quality signing for the money, was an all-star in the first half, obviously struggled down the stretch in the second half. Michael Brantley, 2-year deal, also an all-star. You had Marcus Semien and Robbie Ray, 2 guys who signed 1-year deals with the Blue Jays that worked out just marvelously for that team. I mean, they were both outstanding. Robbie Ray, I believe, a Cy Young finalist. Marcus Semien, 45 home runs. There is value to be found on those 1 or 2-year deals if you sign the right free agent. If you go back to yesterday's podcast, I talked about 3 under-the-radar signings the Mets could make. Maybe you can get any of those guys, whether it was Jorge Soler, Andrew McCutchen, or Mark Canha on a 1 or 2-year deal, and that could prove to be more beneficial to have a player playing for the next contract than signing the guy and potentially getting some fat cat syndrome if you sign some guy to a 6 or 7-year deal. Now, when it comes to free agency this offseason, there's obviously players that are worthy of those long-term deals that the Mets should be talking to and trying to sign right now. But it's just interesting to see how that unfolded for last year's free agent class. Just not a lot of fruit that was bore from that group. But we'll see what happens this time around. The most interesting thing is the timeline here. So when are the Mets going to get into the action? Are they going to get somebody before the CBA comes up? And then how is the CBA going to impact how long, for one, the shutdown is going to be, how long free agency gets dragged out after that? Could we get to a point where a CBA is signed, let's just say at the end of February, and teams now have this frenzy to sign players and get them to report to camp a couple weeks later for spring training? I believe the last time the NBA had a lockdown, that is what happened. It was shut down. Everyone was just buying time, trying to figure out when the next deal would come in place. Once they had a deal, it was, oh, wow, the season's like right here. Now we got to just go. Actually, they even had a shortened season because their lockout took so long. And then it was just a frenzy to try to figure out where everyone would land. So this could end in many different ways. And part of that right now is trying to see if you can get some people signed early so you have a little bit of peace of mind before we get into those really dark days of this winter where there's going to be a contentious negotiation period between the MLBPA and the MLB to try to figure out if they can come to terms on the next collective bargaining agreement that hopefully give us, no labor strikes for a decade. We can only hope. But anyway, that's going to be all for today's edition of Locked On Mets. As always, thank you for listening. Make sure you follow, rate, and review wherever you get your podcast. Make sure you follow me on Twitter at Finkelstein Ryan. Follow the show at Locked On Mets. Thank you for making Locked On Mets your first listen every day. Now for your second listen, check out the Locked On MLB Prospects show hosted by my guy, Aram Layton. Locked On MLB Prospects is the best place to go to learn about the stars of tomorrow. You can find Locked On MLB Prospects wherever you get podcasts.